Complex PTSD and narcissism are closely intertwined. They're not the same thing, but in families, narcissism in a parent can cause complex PTSD in the child. The parent might be emotionally absent or controlling or completely self-centered and have no ability to see or recognize the child's unique and good little self. And you hear all the time about how people struggle with the effects of that, a narcissistic parent, how they become wounded and vulnerable and self-attacking. But what's interesting, and what's never talked about, I think, is how often the parent's narcissistic traits or behaviors are absorbed by the child, to the point that people in the child's adult life might very much feel that they are being wounded by narcissistic behaviors. Now, it's often said that if you have the self-reflection to ask yourself, am I a narcissist? Then you're probably not a narcissist. I'm not sure if that's totally true, because you could just say those words, right? But if you're honest with yourself, you'd have to admit that of course you have some narcissistic behaviors. Everyone does. We all do. We have some tendencies, especially when CPTSD is triggered. And I bring this up because these narcissistic tendencies are pretty much the elephant in the living room around why people with CPTSD struggle with relationships. And none of the abuse was your fault. You did not ask for this to happen to you. But it's worth asking yourself if you're maybe sometimes driving people away with the very same narcissistic tendencies that hurt you in the first place. They're just tendencies. It's very unlikely that you actually have the personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. Personality disorders are really hard to change. But the wounds of childhood PTSD that lead to these tendencies, they can be changed. It's not an overnight job, but they can be changed. This is flexible, and I can tell you how. But first, let's talk about some of the behaviors that show up in traumatized people. Not every symptom of CPTSD looks like narcissism, but let's talk about the ones that do. So first, people with CPTSD have a tendency to focus on how we feel all the time. It becomes very dominant in our consciousness to a degree that it can make it difficult to be sensitive to other people. Have you ever had that? When you're in a lot of emotional pain, it can be very easy to overlook what's going on in your companion's day, what's going on in their life. And I had a period in my life where 3 close family members died in less than a year. Also, I got attacked on the street during that time, and I got dumped, and some other bad things happened. And I was drowning in sorrow. I was drowning in overwhelm, and my PTSD symptoms were just taking over my brain. I was barely able to read or have a conversation. I'd be on the phone talking, and I couldn't even remember who I was talking to sometimes. I was really struggling. And I got the feedback from a friend at that time, that I was being very self-centered. And it made me mad at the time because I couldn't really do better than that at the time. I was very self-centered. I was in deep shock and woundedness. But for the record, it was helpful to know that for other people, it wasn't like having a two-way friendship, right? So if we get stuck in our trauma and we can't have a two-way friendship, that's one reason why we could end up feeling kind of isolated from people, because very few people want to sign up for that, for a relationship where we do all the talking, where we are the designated person who needs to be cared for today. Most people want something a little more mutual, or certainly in a healthy relationship they do. Okay, second thing, we can get very focused on how other people think about us. And these are subtle signs, right? And everybody tends to focus on what other people think about them. But what I noticed about CPTSD in myself and as I teach other people, I teach this technique, the foundation of what I teach to help people heal their symptoms has to do with writing down fearful and resentful thoughts about other people. And those thoughts, sometimes I'm attacking myself, but a lot of times I have fear what other people think about me. I have fear they think that I'm stupid, old, fat, no good, not lovable. They're not including me. And especially early in my healing process, I was really burdened with these ideas. And in effect, it's I'm sort of thinking about myself, but it's all about what do other people think of me? Why haven't they started treating me nicer yet? Why do they keep triggering me? Why can't they change their behavior so life would be easier for me? And in a way, that is a focus on how other people think of us. And I bring that up because it's one of the hallmarks of a narcissist, is that they are very focused on other people and whether other people make things good for them, at the expense of thinking about what do other people need and what's the reciprocal arrangement there. So this is sort of a subset of the first point I made. Okay, third point. When we're symptomatic with CPTSD, we have a belief that our problems are so unique that no one can possibly understand. I hear this all the time when I coach people. They go, well, I have problems you couldn't possibly understand. Now here's the thing about me. I have problems. They're not as bad as some people's. They're worse than other people's. The stuff that I went through in the past was pretty bad, and I don't talk about 90% of it because part of my healing program is, if you take my courses, you'll get some highlights of the bad stuff that happened. But for me to talk about it all the time would really be a bummer for you. It'd be a bummer for me. It would focus on the problem. You know the problem. You have the problem. I focus on talking about the solution. So when people come to me and think that I know somehow what PTSD is like, and I know somehow how to calm the symptoms, but I couldn't possibly understand the problem, that's not always true. Of course, some people have had experiences that I have not had, for better and worse. In the case of certain abusive situations, yes, I'm very grateful I didn't go through what some people went through. But I've had people say stuff like, well, I have to move. I have to move and I'm sick right now and have to go to the doctor. You couldn't possibly understand. It's like, oh my gosh, you think I don't know what it's like? I've had 14 surgeries and was in and out of the hospital. See, it's like a competition. It's not a competition. So when I get into trying to convince somebody I do understand, that's also like a game I don't want to play. And that's why I just want to call out that thing where you go, my problems are so unique, nobody could understand. Now I agree, when you have CPTSD, a lot of people don't understand. They don't understand the nature of it, and they cannot understand why we don't just fix our problems. It's like, why do you keep getting together with the same kind of jerk? Why do you keep overreacting? Why don't you just not overreact? It's so simple for them, right? But we understand each other. More or less, we understand. And I'm calling it out as a narcissistic tendency to just think that your problems are so much worse than anybody else's. I know you know objectively that there are many, many people who have worse problems and who actually handled them okay. And I will just point out to you that every individual is different. You can put like X amount of trauma on this person and this person, and one of them will develop complex PTSD and one person will sail right through it. You do it to a third person and they end up their whole life just collapses and they can't deal with it at all. We're all different. And so there's no point in making comparisons about your troubles and your grief and your solutions. What helps is when you're talking to other people is to look for commonality, look for what you can learn from other people's experience, and what a relief it is when you meet somebody who has been through something similar and who does understand. I went through high school thinking I was the only kid who lived in a chaotic home, and I tried not to tell anybody. A few of my close friends had been to my house and they kind of saw the outward signs of it. And I went to a high school, like a 30-something year high school reunion. Because when I left the town where I went to high school, I graduated a year early and I left and I never came back. I had a lot of shame, was part of the reason I never came back, but I finally went back. I was healed enough and I went back and I connected with people, and I was really surprised how much I liked my former friends and how much we felt connected to each other. And when we really got to talking, we found out that all of us in my group of girls that I was tight friends with in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, all of us had a parent who had an addiction or alcoholism or had died. So we all had been dealing with kind of a major loss of a parent and a lot of the craziness of addiction and alcoholism at home. And none of us were talking about it at the time. And then we got together and we talked about it, and it explained so much. So it is good to be with people who understand. It's also good to be comfortable with people who don't have your experience. They may never understand your wounds, but you can learn so much from people who were less traumatized. So keep an open mind. It's a narcissistic tendency to just think my problems are special. People have to conform to my problems or they don't count. That is a narcissistic thought. And we don't want to go there. We want to heal from those tendencies. All right, the next narcissistic tendency that you sometimes see in CPTSD is a strong victim identity. And this comes up in narcissistic personality disorder. For us, there really was some victimization. And for the record, a lot of people who have narcissistic personality disorder were very traumatized as kids. It may have played a role. It's not the only cause, but it can play a role in why people end up with that personality disorder. So that doesn't mean that it excuses the behavior in them or in us. So the strong victim identity. You were abused, you were neglected, or you wouldn't be on this channel. So you were a victim, but I'm going to encourage you not to let it be your identity. All discomfort and shame that you feel is no longer caused by other people or the past. That's kind of my radical statement here. If you're still having discomfort and shame around other people, what's going on is some present time fear and resentment about that, and that is coming from here. And before you get all offended that I think that I'm saying like, oh, it's all your fault, you create your reality, I'm never saying that. You were abused and neglected. It caused problems. You're having trouble moving on from being completely held down by the problems that causes. Most people will be held down for life. We're here, I'm trying to teach you how to not be held down for life, how to get free. And I'm not saying you deny that you were victimized in the past, but I want you to get in touch with your new identity, which is that you're no longer a victim, or you're learning not to be one, right? Because, a lot of us continue to get victimized because that pattern was laid down in us. But we can learn. We have a brain, and we're adults, and we're free. And with a little bit of persistence and learning, we can begin to change that pattern, and then we're not a victim. Another victim format that you'll see in CPTSD people and narcissists is, I'm the long-suffering victim. I'm so nice all the time, but everyone on the planet is just awful, and they're mean to me for no reason. And I'm kind of making fun of that, because if you think that you're the only nice person on the planet, you actually might have narcissistic personality disorder. None of us is the only nice person on the planet. We're like everybody. We have a mix of good and bad traits. And like everybody else, we do better when we work on healing the bad traits and the vulnerabilities, and we play off the strengths. We gotta love ourselves as we are. But we're not the only good person in the world, and there are many good people out there. And just like there's people who suffer more than we do, there's people who do good things on a scale that any one of us can only guess at, we don't even know. And honestly, if we've spent a lot of our lives kind of held down by trauma, we didn't have a chance to shine. We didn't have a chance to bring our gifts to bear. And that is why it's so important now to heal, because if your gifts, which are in there, you were given gifts, if trauma came in and stopped you from fulfilling those, from becoming your real self and bringing to the world all the good that you have in you, if that got thwarted by trauma, that's terrible. That is the tragedy. That is, I think, that the deepest, most burning source of depression and sort of discouragement is just knowing that you're capable of so much more, but you can't do it. You get so tripped up on things. So you're here, you're watching this video now, and together, that's what we do. We learn to not get tripped up over those things. We learn to sail through them. We learn to handle them so that we continue to be ourselves, so that we can be real and honest about who we are. The next narcissistic trait. People with CPTSD, we can be arrogant sometimes. We think we know how other people should live, or how they should think, or what they need to change about themselves. It pushes people away, to say the least, when we do that. And so you want to check that. It's a very natural thing, and especially if you grew up with trauma, your life may be heavily populated by people with serious problems. When we think we know what somebody else ought to do, and we start saying, honey, I've been through this before, here's what you do, you got to read this book, you got to eat this, you got to not drink that, we're putting ourselves above other people. And sometimes they might want that help. They might be turning to somebody who has that experience, but if they're not, what it feels like is control and arrogance. And it causes them to want to push us away. At its very worst, that kind of control can go to the extreme of being, misguided pressure, and it can be cruel. It comes off as criticism. So if you feel like you're just trying to be helpful to people and you're finding that they're not receptive, that's something you could ask yourself is, do I do that? Am I giving them advice in a way that makes them feel a little bit criticized, or a little bit, like I'm trying to control them? And it can come as a surprise how little you need to do that to influence other people. The best thing you can do if you want to influence other people is to just do really well yourself, to solve your own problems and to show up happy and free in front of them. And then they might ask you one day, how did you do that? But I'll tell you, of all the healing I've ever had, people have rarely spontaneously asked me for advice or changed their life because I sort of rushed in with a solution for them. More what happened was I sort of used my solution and changed my life, and people began to ask. And I suppose when you come find me on YouTube, that's a form of asking. You can watch the video or you can turn it off, but I'm not pushing you to do anything I say. In fact, I tell people all the time, when I give advice about how to deal with this thing called CPTSD, put it on the front porch of how you listen to things. Don't bring it right into your house. Just listen to what it is. See if you agree with it. See if you think you can use it. And don't take it with a grain of salt, because it's my experience. And the best thing you can do is use your experience. Another narcissistic tendency that we sometimes have in CPTSD is we have a hard time seeing our own role in our problems. Not just in that we, think that we're innocent victims and blame other people, but also we have trouble realizing that we have agency. We do have the capacity to discover what's going on in our lives and to change it. It's not easy, and some things are very difficult to change, but we have agency. So that tendency to think, everybody else just controls everything and they make everything bad for me and I can't do anything, that is like a narcissistic tendency. So when we think that other people control things and we can't, what we're basically doing is we're taking our standard allotment of power, which is about like everybody else's. Everybody has some power over themselves. We're taking that and we're giving it to somebody else. And in fact, when we give it to people who abused us and say, well, I was abused, so I can never change, we're taking that power and we're giving it to these people who hurt us in the first place. And further, we sometimes tend to believe that they did it because they targeted us. And that is occasionally what somebody does. A very bad person might target another person for abuse. Most abuse happens by people who are overwhelmed and too messed up inside their own head. Maybe they're narcissists, maybe they have CPTSD, but they're getting overwhelmed and this bad behavior is coming out. So it's not always a product of targeting. And I think believing that all abuse was targeted at you is a form of giving your power away, because it's a way of not seeing that even though you had CPTSD and even though you might not have been able to see it coming, given the information and the strength that you had at the time, you couldn't have done anything about it. You can learn from it and maybe handle such a situation differently next time. I think that people over-assign targeting as the cause of somebody's abuse. Targeting is something that you don't have much control over, do you? You have less control. Whatever you do, however you interpret what happened to you, try to see if, given what you know now about CPTSD and about yourself and other people, is there a way that you could protect yourself from that happening again without having to cut everybody out of your life, without having to make everybody on the planet bad? To try to keep your heart open. Your heart is going to play a big role in you becoming your real self. So you shutting your heart down, you cutting people off, it's not a good solution to the problem of CPTSD. It's a temporary solution. It's a temporary solution and it saved you, and that's great. But now we're going to help you open your heart again. There's a similarity here in that a person feels too fragile to hear criticism. And I think in the case of narcissism, a person cannot be messed with in this belief that they're perfect and above everything. A person with CPTSD is fragile just worrying that they're worthy enough to deserve to be part of the human race, right? There's a real low self-esteem there. Criticism takes on a power that it really doesn't have. It takes on a power in the ears of a person with CPTSD to be very destructive, and that mirrors a narcissistic tendency. And it's not a good one to have. We need a coping mechanism to deal with criticism sometimes so that it doesn't get in, so that we can keep it on the front porch of our listening and not let it into the house. And consider, is it good criticism? Is it something we need to hear and can learn from? Or is it just junk that somebody's throwing at us? That's the case sometimes. Another narcissistic tendency, we are drawn to troubled people who are less functional than we are sometimes, and who see us as bigger, better, smarter, more successful, the leader, or even the savior. People who have narcissism want to be surrounded by people who look up to them. I've noticed that people with CPTSD tend to sort of split it and have difficulty with equal relationships sometimes. So there's always one person is up or down. I've certainly noticed that before I was healing, that my relationships were all either I was kind of the person who had more power or the other person was. And either I was getting resented or I was doing the resenting. So unequal relationships have a place in the world, and that would be normal with a parent and a child, or an employer and a worker. You know, somebody's in charge there. So there's a place for that. But of course, for our closest relationships, we want to have the capacity for equal relationships. Part of healing is to develop comfort to have that. And equal relationships have a whole lot of level of communication that can be tricky with CPTSD, and I think that's why there's an attraction to unequal relationships, because you don't even have that you don't really have to work out certain fine nuanced problems. It's just like, well, the boss says, you know, this is how we're going to solve this problem. So it's a way of skipping over the part that's complicated. As you heal, that's going to get easier for you. So that's something you might want to look at in your life. Another narcissistic tendency: we sometimes make big sweeping accusations at people. We say stuff like, you know, education is just brainwashing for the masses, or religion is all about social control. These things are not true. Those are resentful, big sweeping statements. Another one you hear all the time is, everyone I know is a narcissist, but of course I'm not. I'm exempt from this. And that sort of sweeping declaration is a narcissistic tendency. If you pay attention to reality, of course not everyone is a narcissist. And I see this particularly in YouTube comments, people who just say, it's a terrible world out there, nobody cares about other people anymore. And we know when we read those comments, they're talking about their experience, they're having a terrible experience, and it feels like it's everybody. But that's what happens with CPTSD, is that kind of thinking can calcify, and ultimately that's a very self-centered and narcissistic style thought. You know, I'm the only good person, everybody out there is bad. It puts us above everybody, and, you know, of course nobody likes it. It pushes people away. And usually it's said by people who have already resigned themselves to that by declaring, everybody's bad, I'm gonna isolate myself, it's the only way. And I think some people's PTSD is so bad that is for now the best solution there is. But I'm here for anybody who's ready to take that next step and try to reconnect with people, you know, to help look at the behaviors that get in the way, including these narcissist style behaviors that you may have inherited. Now here's one. I don't think this is as common as some of the other ones, but it's a narcissistic tendency, and it's a sense of entitlement, where we believe that other people are sort of like the grown-ups and they're responsible to make our lives better or make the world better, and even pay for everything like housing, food, therapy. And this reflects an unhealthy belief that we have a special status as people who are just damaged and have to be taken care of, but who don't have any obligation to other people. And so we very easily see the obligation of some people towards people like ourselves. We don't see our obligation right back. And I totally understand, and I've been the person who could not fulfill certain obligations because what was happening in my life was too great. But there have been other times when I had the joy of sort of stepping up a little bit and becoming one of those people. And I really want to put it out there that whether you can do it in a big way or a small way, when you rise up to start bringing that goodness that you're holding latent in you under the CPTSD, when you start to bring it into the world, you're going to feel a joy, you're going to feel a freedom, you're going to feel a power that you never could have had when you were waiting for other people to solve your problems for you. We all need help sometimes, but in every little way that you can, see what you can do to become that person, even if it's in a tiny way, helping somebody who lives on your street, all right? Now, if you think that you have CPTSD, I don't think you'd be here if you didn't, but if you're wondering, you can take this quiz where I list the common symptoms, and that's linked below. I put it on the very top line of the description section right under the video. There's also a link there where you can click it and it will open up. It says more. You can open up and see all the links I put there. Now, if you're resonating with this video and you want to look at more ways that you might be having better relationships with people, the next video I picked out that I think goes really nicely from this one is right here, and I encourage you to watch it, and I will see you next time.